So, today we're going to decode a secret weapon that was used in a massive battle for the English throne. And nope, it wasn't a sword or a spy, it was a poem. And honestly, it was one of the most brilliant and frankly dangerous pieces of political art ever written. Let's dive in.
Okay, I want you to picture this. It's 17th century England. Tensions are just sky high. The whole country is teetering on the brink of civil war. And you want to publicly tear down your political opponents. The problem? One wrong word, and you could find yourself locked up in the Tower of London. So how on earth do you do it?
You get clever. You disguise your attack. You hide the whole thing in plain sight, crafting a masterpiece so smart, so layered that your enemies can't even touch you, even while you're taking apart their reputation piece by piece.
And that's exactly what England's poet laureate, a guy named John Dryden, did. He wrote Absalom and Achitophel, a work that on the surface looks like a simple Bible story, but is actually a pretty devastating political takedown. So let's solve this 340-year-old puzzle together.
All right, so first things first, we gotta understand the cover story. To pull off a trick this brilliant, Dryden needed to use a really powerful literary tool.
See, he used what's called an allegory. It's basically a story where all the characters and all the events are just symbols for a real-life political situation. Dryden's true genius here was picking a story that literally every single person in his audience would know by heart. He went with the biblical story of King David from the Book of Samuel. It's this super tragic tale. You've got this popular, handsome son named Absalom, and he gets convinced by this sly, cunning advisor, Achitophel, to rebel against his own father, the king. Well, the kingdom gets torn apart by civil war, and in the end, the rebellion fails and Absalom is killed. It's the perfect story about ambition, betrayal, and the dangers of challenging a rightful ruler. So why that story? Why that one specifically? Well, because it was a perfect mirror of the real-life political crisis that was blowing up in England at that exact moment. Let's pull back the curtain on the world Dryden was living in. At the very heart of the crisis was one single explosive fact. England was a fiercely Protestant nation, but the heir to the throne, King Charles II's brother, James, was a Catholic. And that one issue created this massive wave of panic and paranoia across the country. And you can see just how quickly things spiraled out of control. First, the heir, James, converts in 1673. Then, a few years later, a completely made-up conspiracy, the Popish plot, ignites this mass hysteria about a Catholic plan to murder the king. This fear leads right into the exclusion crisis, where a political party, the Whigs, tried to legally block James from ever taking the throne. And then boom, right at the peak of all this chaos, in 1681, Dryden drops his poem. Okay, so we've got the biblical story on one hand, and we've got the political crisis on the other. Now for the really fun part, let's put them together and crack this code. Here it is, the secret key, totally decoded. Dryden mapped the real-life players directly onto the biblical characters. King David, well, that was King Charles II. The rebellious son, Absalom, that was the Duke of Monmouth. And the evil advisor, Achitophel, that was the Earl of Shaftesbury, who just so happened to be the leader of the opposition Whig party. Let's break down each one. Dryden paints King Charles as David, not as some tyrant, but as a patient, merciful father to the nation. He's shown as this legitimate ruler who loves his rebellious son, but is ultimately committed to peace and stability above all else. I mean, it is masterful royalist propaganda. Now, Absalom represents the Duke of Monmouth. And what's really fascinating here is that Monmouth was King Charles's illegitimate son, but he was a Protestant and he was super popular. The Whigs were actually pushing him as a replacement for the Catholic heir. Dryden portrays him as handsome and charismatic, sure, but also weak, way too ambitious, and easily manipulated. He's a tragic figure, not the real villain. Now, the true villain of the poem is Achitophel, and this is just a scathing caricature of the Earl of Shaftesbury, the guy masterminding the whole exclusion crisis. Dryden paints him as this brilliant but totally corrupt politician who doesn't actually care about religion at all. He just wants to seize power by manipulating the young Monmouth and whipping up public fear. So, now that we've cracked the code, you can see this wasn't just some clever story. This was a political weapon, plain and simple. And to understand how it worked so well, we need to look at the powerful tool Dryden used to forge it. Remember our author, John Dryden? As the poet laureate, he was basically the official voice of the court. His job was to defend the king, and he did it with his greatest skill, satire. Satire is really the art of the attack. It's using wit and really sharp language, not just to tell a story, but to mock, to expose, and to ultimately dismantle your opponent by making them look foolish, dangerous, or just plain corrupt. And let me tell you, Dryden wields this weapon like a master. He creates this incredibly stark contrast. The king is wise, merciful, a force for peace. Shaftesbury, his total opposite, is a self-serving manipulator who just thrives on chaos and division. For anyone reading this in 1681, the message was impossible to miss. Look, Dryden went even deeper. He wasn't just defending a man, he was defending an entire idea. The core political philosophy of the time was something called the divine right of kings. This belief that a king's power comes directly from God. So, what does that mean? It means to rebel against the king wasn't just treason, it was a sin against God himself. And this really reveals Dryden's ultimate mission. He was using the immense power of poetry to slam his enemies, defend the whole idea of monarchy, warn everyone about the chaos of another civil war, and persuade his readers that loyalty to the king was the only real path to stability. So what happened? Well, the crisis eventually did pass. The Whigs failed in their attempt, and the monarchy survived. But the poem's influence lasted. And that's the real takeaway here. Absalom and Achitophel is way more than just a historical document. It's a masterclass in using storytelling to shape public opinion, to defend an ideology, and to attack your enemies. It is timeless, powerful proof that art can be one of the most potent political weapons there is. Dryden's masterpiece really proves that sometimes the sharpest weapon in a political fight isn't a sword at all, but a story. Which, of course, leaves us with a fascinating question for our own time. When is art the most powerful political weapon?